But anyway, Ivan Karamazov that Camus talks about now, he appears in what is, I suppose, Dostoevsky's most celebrated book, The Brothers Karamazov, which tells about three brothers. There's a lot of novels, especially Russian novels, that talk about three brothers or three sisters or two brothers or three suitors for one woman. That's in a Turgenev one. But they seem to represent three opinions or three aspects of a question or three points of view about the state of Russia and its future or some other important subject. And then the characters and the life experiences and what they do and say of those three characters works out those 3 points of view. So in The Brothers Karamazov, there's Alyosha, who's a very saintly young man who is the protege of an even more saintly monk. There's Dmitri, who's passionately devoted to a particular woman. So they're very similar to characters in another Dostoevsky novel, the one we talked about before, The Idiot. Alyosha is very similar to the main character in The Idiot, in being a person who is so saintly that he almost appears simple-minded to people around him. Dmitri is very similar to another character in The Idiot who's insanely devoted to this particular woman. He's prepared to give up everything, his money, his time, his inheritance, his relationships, everything in his life. He will just throw them away to get this woman who is more than half crazy herself. So they're very similar in those two novels. Then there's Ivan Karamazov, the third brother in the Karamazov brothers. And this is the one that Camus is talking about now in The Myth of Sisyphus, and he really likes what Ivan's saying, particularly because Ivan, when confronted by this problem of the absurd, he doesn't call it the absurd, but it's the same problem that Camus is talking about as the absurd. Ivan's appreciated the same issue, and he simply just defies it. He doesn't try to find any way out of it. He doesn't try to find any escape or any comforting way to get around it. He just sees that it's there, but he doesn't care. He refuses to accept that it's a problem. He's going to do what he's going to do anyway. So Ivan is the kind of the more intellectual, more cold and calculating of the three brothers, and there's a suspicion that there's something almost satanic about him. But so Camus really likes Ivan's approach to the problem. So he dismisses those ways to escape from the absurd, but he says, well, we just have to accept it, and we defy it, really. We live despite it. So I'm now proposing to read a few passages from the book to show that I haven't just been making this up, that this is actually what Camus was thinking and writing about. So I'm quoting from this Penguin edition of The Myth of Sisyphus, and starting from a section which is called Philosophical Suicide, starting on page 45. So he's talking initially about and referring to Plato, obviously the Greek philosopher from the 4th and 5th centuries BC, and someone called Husserl, who was a German philosopher in the 19th and 20th centuries. And Plato had this idea that the things that we see that exist in this world, the phenomena that we encounter, have some essence behind them in some other transcendental realm that gives them their meaning and existence. And Husserl was talking about laws that impart meaning to physical objects. Anyway, so for Husserl speaks likewise of extratemporal essences brought to light by the intention, and he sounds like Plato. All things are not explained by one thing, but by all things. I see no difference. There is no longer a single idea explaining everything, but an infinite number of essences giving a meaning to an infinite number of objects. The world comes to a stop, but also lights up. Platonic realism becomes intuitive, but it is still realism. Kierkegaard was swallowed up in his God. And a bit further down, speaking about people who believe these philosophical ideas, he is taught in fact that every image presupposes an equally privileged essence. In this ideal world without hierarchy, the formal army is composed solely of generals. So each person is not just a representation of the fact that God exists, but each person is very important in his own right because he has some individual essence backing him up. So he's very important. Every one of us is individually important. If all masses subject to attraction were to disappear, the law of attraction would not be destroyed, but would simply remain without any possible application. So we're saying like there's a law of gravity, and that would, even if there were no objects, no masses in the universe, the law of gravity would still be a law and it would still be just as important, even if it had no matter to act on. If we could contemplate clearly the exact laws of psychic processes, they would be seen to be likewise eternal and invariable, like the basic laws of theoretical natural science. So that's what Husserl is saying, but that's again what Camus is not accepting. So then he goes on to again repeat his idea that he can't see any meaning to anything. He doesn't want to, and he almost gets a bit annoyed that other people are claiming to see some meaning, and he wants to just put that to one side. So this is on page 51 of this book. I don't know whether this world has a meaning that transcends it, but I know that I do not know that meaning, and that it is impossible for me just now to know it. I can understand only in human terms. And these two certainties, my appetite for the absolute and for unity, and the impossibility of reducing this world to a rational and reasonable principle, I also know that I cannot reconcile them. What other truth can I admit without lying, without bringing in a hope I lack, which means nothing within the limits of my condition? And then a bit later, repeating that same idea, but also then introducing the idea that it's heroic to face that meaninglessness and nothingnessness, and if we don't do that, we're kind of cowards in a way. Then he goes on on page 52, this is now in the section called Absurd Freedom. The hell of the present is his kingdom at last. Abstract evidence retreats before the poetry of forms and colours. Spiritual conflicts become embodied and return to the abject and magnificent shelter of man's heart. None of them is settled, but all are transfigured. Is one going to die, escape by the leap, rebuild a mansion of ideas and forms to one's own scale? Is one, on the contrary, going to take up the heart-rending and marvellous wager of the absurd? And then again, sort of building on that same idea about the courage of the man who just defies the meaningless of life, and then moving from that onto this kind of perhaps defiance of God in a way, this Ivan Karamazov approach. Anyway, so this section starts, you're leading on from the one we just read. The absurd man is tempted. History is not lacking in either religions or prophets, even without gods. He is asked to leap. All he can reply is that he doesn't fully understand, that it is not obvious. Indeed, he does not want to do anything but what he fully understands. He is assured that this is the sin of pride, but he does not understand the notion of sin, that perhaps hell is in store, that he is losing immortal life. An attempt is made to get him to admit his guilt. He feels innocent. To tell the truth, that is all he feels, his irreparable innocence. This is what allows him everything. And then he goes on further to dismiss the idea of suicide, like the Kirillov approach to taking one's own life, which he feels is not an answer either. It may be thought that suicide follows revolt, but wrongly, for it does not represent the logical outcome of revolt. It is just the contrary by the consent it presupposes. Suicide, like the leap, is acceptance at its extreme. In its way, suicide settles the absurd. It engulfs the absurd in the same death. But I know that in order to keep alive, the absurd cannot be settled. It is at the extreme limit of the condemned man's last thought, that shoelace that despite everything he sees a few yards away. That last bit's referring to something also that appears in The Outsider. So then from that he goes on to say about how really the only way to face it is somehow to arrange to be put to death, to be executed. The contrary of suicide, in fact, is the man condemned to death, or as happened with Merceau. And then from that he moves on to this further idea of a kind of a Don Juan-like, Prometheus-like, Lucifer perhaps-like rebellion against God almost. This is on page 54, sorry. To a man devoid of blinkers, there is no finer sight than that of the intelligence it grips with a reality that transcends it. The sight of human pride is unequalled. And on page 55, it is essential to die unreconciled and not of one's own free will. Suicide is a repudiation. And then a little bit further on from that he talks about the problem of what is freedom and where does God stand in that. So he says, the problem of freedom as such has no meaning, for it is linked in quite a different way with the problem of God. Knowing whether or not man is free involves knowing whether he can have a master. The absurdity peculiar to this problem comes from the fact that the very notion that makes the problem of freedom possible also takes away all its meaning. For in the presence of God there is less a problem of freedom than a problem of evil. You know the alternative. Either we are not free and God the all-powerful is responsible for evil, or we are free and responsible, but God is not all-powerful. All the scholastic subtleties have neither added anything to nor subtracted anything from the acuteness of this paradox.